So let's think about what that means. So we've got this argument that Descartes puts forward. I can imagine my mind without my body. And Descartes says that shows that, in fact, my mind is something separate from my body. Well, I can imagine the evening star without the morning star. So son of Descartes, Descartesan, has to say, oh, so that shows that the morning star and the evening star are two different things. But Descartesan would be wrong when he says that. The morning star and the evening star aren't two different things. They're just one thing, namely Venus. In fact, the sentence, they are one thing, slightly misleading, right? It's just one thing, Venus. If that argument, if trying to run the Cartesian argument for astronomy fails, yet it seems to be an exactly analogous argument, we ought to conclude that the argument for the distinctness of the mind and the body must fail as well. Now that seems to me to be right. I think the Cartesian argument does fail, and I think the example of the evening star and the morning star, which is not at all original to me, that this example shows, this counterexample shows that Descartes' original argument doesn't work either. Well, at least that's how it seems to me. Though, as I say, there are philosophers who say, no, that's not right. Maybe somehow we've misunderstood how the argument goes, and it doesn't exactly, although these two arguments seemed parallel, they're not in fact parallel. There's some subtle differences that if we're not looking carefully, we'll overlook. But, well, as I say, the debate goes on. One of the reasons for thinking it's not clear whether the argument fails or not is because it's hard to pin down where exactly did it go wrong. Look, take the argument of the planets, the morning star and the evening star example. I take it that we all agree that when we attempt to run the Cartesian argument in terms of the morning star and the evening star, it fails. But it's harder to say what went wrong. How did it go wrong? Why did it go wrong? What are the possibilities? Well, we said, look, first premise. I can imagine a world in which the evening star exists but the morning star doesn't. Well, I suppose one possible response would be, you couldn't really do that. You thought you were imagining a world in which the evening star exists and the morning star doesn't. But you weren't really imagining a world in which the evening star exists and the morning star doesn't. You've misdescribed what it is you've imagined. Well, that's not a silly thing to say about the astronomy case. Maybe that's the right diagnosis. Could we similarly say, I didn't really imagine a world in which my mind exists but my body doesn't? That little story I told last time, I thought I was describing a world in which my mind exists, my body doesn't, but it wasn't really imagining a world like that. That doesn't seem so persuasive over there. Did seem as though I was imagining it. What else could go wrong with the astronomy example? Well, maybe I did imagine a world in which the morning star exists and the evening star doesn't exist, but maybe imagining doesn't mean it's possible. Normally we think if we imagine something, it means it's possible. Here I don't mean, of course, empirically possible. I can imagine a world with unicorns. Doesn't mean I think unicorns are physically possible. All we mean here is logically possible. I can imagine a world with unicorns. Seems to follow that unicorns are logically possible. Imagination seems to be a guide to possibility, but maybe not always. Maybe sometimes we can imagine something that's really impossible. Try to imagine, can you do that or can't you not do that? Try to imagine a round square. Can you imagine it? Can you not imagine it? In certain moods, I sort of feel I can just begin to imagine it. And of course, it doesn't really mean it's possible. Seems like it's impossible. So maybe imagination is a flawed guide to possibility. So maybe that's what we should say about the mind-body case. Yeah, I can imagine a world in which my mind exists, but my body doesn't. But that doesn't show that it's really possible, logically possible, to have a world in which my mind exists and my body doesn't. Maybe that's where the argument goes wrong. On the other hand, isn't imagination our best guide to logical possibility? Isn't the reason I think unicorns are logically coherent is because I can imagine them so easily? Another possibility, maybe we should say the mere fact that it's possible for A and B to be separate, for A to exist without B, for example, that's clearly where they're separate. The mere fact that it's possible for them to be separate doesn't mean that in the actual world they are separate. Maybe the argument goes wrong by assuming that identity, when A is equal to B, it's always equal to B no matter what. Maybe identity, as philosophers like to put it, maybe identity is contingent. Maybe A could be the same thing as B in this logically possible world, but we could imagine a completely different logically coherent world in which A was not the same thing as B. If that's right, then maybe the conclusion should be, well, yeah, the Cartesian thought experiment shows that there could be a world in which there are minds that are not identical to bodies, but that doesn't mean that in this world the mind is not identical to my body. Maybe in this world minds and bodies are identical, even though in other logically possible worlds the identity comes apart. Identity is not necessary but contingent, as the philosophers put it. It's not clear whether that's right either. The notion of contingent identity is very puzzling. After all, if A really is B, how could they come apart? There's only one thing there. There's nothing to come apart. There's just A equals B, that single thing. What's to come apart? So where exactly does the argument break down? Is it that I'm not really imagining, I'm just thinking I'm imagining? Is it that imagination's not really a good guide to possibility? Often it is, but not always? Is it that identity is contingent? The interesting thing about Descartes' argument is that it's easy to see something has gone wrong in the case of the morning star and the evening star, but it's difficult to pin down what exactly went wrong. Different philosophers agree that something's gone wrong in the morning star and the evening star case, but disagree about the best diagnosis of where the mistake went in. Armed with your pet diagnosis of where the argument goes wrong there, you've got to ask, does it also go wrong in the mind and body case?